Yeah, this argument in favor of infanticide is, at least in my view, pretty well rooted in the history of philosophy with Jeremy Bentham.
Oh, with Bentham?
Yeah, and he's father of the French Revolution,
yeah,
as well as father of a lot of the revolutions in Latin America.
Sure.
Very good friends with a lot of the founding fathers of many Latin American countries. Had pretensions of being the legislator of the world, and he was actually his ideas created a lot of tension in certain Latin American countries. Where he comes from, Colombia. In 1828, there was already a big debate whether or not to accept Bentham's ideas at universities.
His ideas about infanticide?
In general.
In general,
in general,
okay.
In general. But there was big tension. There were actually almost like wars between parties, and when one party won, they would take Bentham out of the university curriculum, and the other party won, they would place Bentham.
Right.
So it's not an argument we can simply think that it's
not a big deal.
It's not a big deal. It's really pretty well rooted in the history of philosophy and of many countries' political thought.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that there's a lot of, I am not a philosopher, and there's a lot of ideas that happen in philosophy that I think within the context of philosophy seem very compelling. But when I try to sort of gauge the strength of one of my arguments or one of pro-choice's arguments, I try to imagine, and I apologize because this is very American-centric, but I try to imagine what the average American would think of that argument. And in my opinion, I don't really have statistics to back this up, but in my opinion, the average American would react with horror if they thought that abortion meant we must legalize infanticide, or if they thought that they were equivalent. In fact, this isn't a statistic, but just as an anecdote, probably a lot of you are familiar with Kermit Gosnell. And it was only in the last year or so that he finally went to trial for, in case you don't know, Kermit Gosnell was an abortionist, and they found that the conditions at his clinic were abhorrent, and women had died from improper medical care, and babies, not fetuses, born babies, had been born alive and had their spinal cords snipped when the abortions didn't go correctly. And when that happened, everyone that I know, and I don't just mean everyone I know within the pro-life, pro-choice debate, I mean everyone I know that wasn't even in the abortion debate, thought it was disgusting and horrific, and it was horrible. In fact, it was so bad that pro-choicers tried to claim this is what will happen if we make abortion illegal, which is interesting since it was all in a legal clinic. But anyway, so I would say that most people, in terms of the average American, would not be okay with that, and that's why I don't worry about it too much. I can't speak to other countries or other...
Philosophically, I think it's one of the strongest, it's one of the most coherent arguments.
It's coherent,
it's
yes.
Very, very coherent.
It's consistent.
Because abortionists cannot make a coherent argument as to when you really become a person.
Right.
But he is extremely coherent. It's a 200-year-old argument.
Yeah.
Okay, he said when you're 1 year old and you have consciousness, from that moment you can feel pain, and therefore you have utility, and therefore from there on you can be happy, but before then, it's a true lover of humanity should be willing to kill a baby from 0 to 1 year old.
Yeah, I think
if that enhances the happiness of humanity.
It's a very
so
utilitarian argument.
Totally utilitarian.
Yeah.
And totally consistent. And
this is the problem with utilitarianism.
Right, and my fear is that oftentimes in many countries, it's not the majority that makes the laws. It's a very small minority.
That's a good point.
That can be very influenced by these types of ideas.
That's a really good point, actually. In that sense, yeah, you should be able to address it, because here I'm always thinking in terms of what most people will think, but you're right, there are a lot of situations where it's not, well, the Roe v. Wade wasn't most people.
Yeah, and that has been the case in Latin America. 9 people, 8 people, 5 people were judges. They changed the entire laws of the country.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. And in terms of that, but Peter Singer, in terms of the American pro-choice movement, Peter Singer is not well favored. Whenever, at least for me, whenever I bring him up, or I bring up that paper that came out 2 years ago, whenever it was in the Journal of Ethics, pro-choicers get angry at me for bringing it up, and they say that it's not representative and it's a straw man. That's what they say. So, in my experience, they don't want to talk about those among their midst who are trying to be consistent and trying to be coherent, because they know that the implication for the pro-choice movement is terrible. In fact, in some ways, I almost wish people like Peter Singer had a much louder voice, because I think that many people would start to have a much stronger feeling toward the pro-life side if they thought that abortion was so related to infanticide. But it's all, that's just in my experience. I can't really speak to it statistically. Yeah.
So, I will discuss some philosophical issues afterwards, which is somewhat complicated. Strategically, would you say Judith Jarvis Thompson's Darwinist argument succeeds for women who have been have pregnancy because of forcible sexual intercourse? That's number one. And
Okay.
number two, would you also support the case that like support against religious institutions that also are against contraceptive measures? There are many religious institutions that do that, and that is, I feel, an active form of harm, regardless of what your position is on abortion. Would you then be also come out in open support against their policy of that contraception itself should be opposed?
Just to make sure I understand you correctly, for the second question, you're saying that you believe it would be harmful to come out against the institution?
No,
Or that it's harmful that they
you
take
are in
that
support
policy?
of the fact that, so if there are people who are saying that religious institutions should not oppose contraception, you would also support that argument.
Okay, so the first question was, does Thompson's violinist argument succeed in the cases of rape? And the second question was, when religious institutions oppose contraception, how does secular pro-life feel about that?
Yes.
Okay, so for the first question, the rape exception and abortion in cases of rape, secular pro-life specifically refuses to take a stance on the rape exception because there are, amongst our members and amongst our leadership, there is not agreement on this, okay? The president of our group, Kelsey, believes there should not be a rape exception, for example, and I think that there should be a rape exception. Specifically not an official secular pro-life position. We invite people to blog for us on either side and discuss it. But, in my opinion, Thompson's analogy is not perfect for the cases of rape, but it is much more convincing because the biggest problem with Thompson's analogy is the responsibility objection.
Yes.
But you cannot say that a survivor of rape is in any way responsible for being pregnant. And if you do, we are going to have a problem, okay? So I think that when you take away the responsibility objection, that makes your case much stronger. There are still some differences that other pro-lifers will argue make it insufficient. We have blog posts about that. I might not be the best person to give them to you because I don't agree. But they'll talk about killing versus letting die. They'll talk about, some of them will talk about the naturalness of pregnancy versus the unnaturalness of the violinist, which I feel like is sort of cheating because it's hard to come up with a natural example that isn't pregnancy, that is similar to pregnancy. I would say, in my opinion, yes, Thompson's violinist argument is very strong for the cases of rape. And I would note that it still means morally, it would be the kindness and I think the morally correct thing to do to stay plugged into the violinist, and I think that it would be a kindness and the morally correct thing to do to carry a pregnancy that resulted from rape. I just don't know if there's a strong enough argument to say it should be legally obligated. So I'm not saying, just to be very clear, I'm not saying that children as the result of rape are worth any less than children as the result of consensual sex. I think it's horrible if people suggest as much. But what I was trying to explain with the bodily rights argument is the value of the person whose life you're talking about is not the only factor in the abortion debate. And I think it's an oversimplification to suggest as much. I hope that makes sense. And then the second question about contraception, secular pro-life's main motivation is coalition building. We want to work with people of faith and groups of faith and other secular groups and anybody who wants to help us decrease abortion rates, whether it's through social support, certain legislative action, and so on. So I think on a personal level, we think that education about contraception and access to contraception are helpful to the pro-life cause. We recognize that many people disagree, and we are not actually very interested in fighting with them about that. I consider that sort of a related but subtopic. The main thing we're interested in is opening minds to the pro-life position in a very general way. I would say that we would like it if more people had access to contraception and more people understood it, but we are not going to fight with religious institutions about that. I recognize, for example, that the Catholic Church has done tremendous amounts of good in terms of their charity, in terms of their support for pregnant women, and other churches too. So I don't think I really feel comfortable saying, yeah, you guys are doing amazing work over here, but can you fix this? Like, if they change their mind, I'd be happy for them to, but we're not going to formally come out and say, you guys shouldn't be doing this, you guys shouldn't be doing that. I mean, that opens the door to all sorts of arguments that we don't want to be having, really. We just want to work together where we can. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.